What happens when one of Britain's most beloved morning hosts loses control on live television? In just 39 seconds, a simple question ignited an on-air explosion that would leave the studio audience gasping, the panel members frozen in shock, and one guest walking off the set in the middle of a live broadcast. It started like any other Tuesday morning on the Lorraine Kelly Show. The studio lights were warm, the audience was settled in their seats, and the panel was ready for what they thought would be a lighthearted chat about comedy and the entertainment industry. Ricky Gervais, fresh off his latest stand-up tour, was the special guest. He walked onto the set with his usual casual demeanor, waving to the audience as they applauded. He took his seat on the cream-colored sofa next to panelist Sarah, a lifestyle columnist, and across from James, a television critic who had been a regular on the show for years. Lorraine Kelly swept onto the set in a bright purple dress, her signature smile plastered across her face. She settled into her chair, shuffled her notes, and turned to face Ricky with an enthusiasm that seemed just a touch too performative. "Ricky, Ricky, Ricky," Lorraine began, drawing out his name like she was scolding a naughty child. "Welcome back to the show. It's been, 3 years since you were last here? Something like that." Ricky replied with a polite smile. "Good to be back." "Well, I have to say," Lorraine continued, leaning forward in her chair, "when I heard you were coming on, I thought, oh dear, here we go. What's he gonna say this time that'll get everyone all worked up?" The audience laughed nervously. Ricky's smile tightened just slightly at the corners. "I'm just here to talk about the tour, Lorraine," he said evenly. "Oh, I'm sure, she said, waving her hand dismissively. "But you do have a reputation, don't you? For saying things that are, shall we say, a bit near the knuckle?" Sarah, the lifestyle columnist sitting next to Ricky, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She glanced at James, who was already looking down at his own notes, seemingly trying to distance himself from whatever was about to unfold. "I think I have a reputation for being honest," Ricky corrected, his tone still friendly but with a slight edge creeping in. Lorraine let out a sharp laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Honest, that's one way to put it. Some might say you're just deliberately provocative for attention." The studio went quiet. Even the audience seemed to sense that something was off. This wasn't the usual playful banter that morning television thrived on. This felt personal. Ricky sat back in his seat, crossing one leg over the other. "Well, Lorraine, I'd say there's a difference between being provocative and just saying what other people are too scared to say. Comedy is about pushing boundaries. It always has been." "Pushing boundaries," Lorraine repeated, her voice dripping with condescension. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like you're just trying to stay relevant by being offensive." Sarah's eyes widened. She opened her mouth as if to interject, but no words came out. James cleared his throat loudly, finally looking up from his notes. "Lorraine," James said carefully, "I think what Ricky does is actually quite clever. He makes people think about why they're offended in the first place." "Oh, please," Lorraine snapped, turning her attention briefly to James. "Don't defend him. You critics are all the same. You overthink everything. Sometimes a joke is just a bad joke, and someone needs to have the courage to say it." She turned back to Ricky, her eyes narrowing. "You make millions by making fun of people, by punching down, and then you hide behind this idea that it's all just comedy." Ricky uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, his expression serious now. "Punching down? Lorraine, I've never punched down in my life. I make fun of power, of hypocrisy, of people who take themselves too seriously. If anything, I'm punching up." "Oh, is that right?" Lorraine shot back. "So when you make jokes about certain groups of people, that's punching up, is it?" "I make jokes about ideas," Ricky said, his voice rising slightly. "About beliefs. About the absurdity of life. I don't target people for who they are. I target the ridiculous things people do and say." Lorraine leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. "Well, I think that's a convenient excuse. You say whatever you want, offend whoever you want, and then when people call you out on it, you just say, 'Oh, it's comedy, lighten up.' It's cowardly, frankly." The word cowardly hung in the air like a grenade. The audience was completely silent now. Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear into the sofa cushions. James rubbed his forehead, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. Ricky's jaw tightened. "Cowardly? You're calling me a coward?" "Yes," Lorraine said sharply. "I am. Because real courage would be admitting that maybe just maybe, you've gone too far sometimes. That maybe you've hurt people with your words, but you won't do that, will you? Because your ego won't allow it. Ricky stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice calm but firm. Lorraine, I've spent my entire career standing up for what I believe in. I've been criticized, attacked, threatened, and I've never once backed down. I've defended the right to free speech, to artistic expression, to the idea that comedy should be allowed to go anywhere it needs to go. If you think that makes me a coward, then I honestly don't know what to say to you. Of course you don't, Lorraine said with a bitter laugh. Because you can't handle criticism, can you? You can dish it out, but you can't take it. That's not fair, Sarah suddenly spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. Ricky's been very gracious this whole time. I think we should maybe move on to talking about the tour. Lorraine's head snapped toward Sarah. Excuse me? I'm conducting this interview. I don't need you telling me how to do my job. Sarah's face flushed red, and she looked down at her lap. James shifted in his seat, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Lorraine? James tried again. Maybe we should take a breath here. This is getting a bit heated. I don't need you mansplaining the situation to me either, James, Lorraine snapped. I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm holding someone accountable for once instead of just fawning all over them like everyone else does. Ricky stood up. The sudden movement made everyone freeze. What are you doing? Lorraine asked, her voice sharp with surprise. I'm leaving, Ricky said simply. He reached up and unclipped the small microphone from his shirt collar. You can't just leave, Lorraine said, her voice rising in pitch. We're in the middle of an interview. No, Ricky said, placing the microphone on the arm of the sofa. You're in the middle of an attack, and I don't have to sit here and listen to it. This is so typical, Lorraine said, standing up from her own chair now. You're running away because you can't handle a real conversation. A real conversation? Ricky repeated, his voice incredulous. Lorraine, you've done nothing but insult me since I sat down. You called me provocative, offensive, a coward. You've accused me of hurting people, of punching down, of being attention-seeking. And when I try to defend myself, you tell me I can't take criticism. This isn't a conversation. This is you grandstanding. The audience was dead silent. Some people had their hands over their mouths. Others were looking around at each other, unsure of what to do. I'm doing my job, Lorraine insisted, her face flushed now. My job is to ask tough questions. No, Ricky said, shaking his head. Your job is to interview guests, to have interesting passive conversations, to entertain your audience. What you're doing right now is using me as a punching bag so you can feel morally superior. How dare you? Lorraine said, her voice shaking with anger. I've been nothing but professional. Professional? Ricky let out a short, humorless laugh. You've been hostile from the moment I sat down. And honestly, I don't know what I did to deserve it, but I'm not going to stick around to find out. He turned to Sarah and James. Sorry, you two had to witness this. You seem like good people. Sarah gave him a small, sympathetic smile. James nodded, looking relieved that someone was finally acknowledging how uncomfortable this had become. Ricky turned back to Lorraine. I hope you got what you wanted out of this, whatever that was. What I wanted, Lorraine said, her voice tight, was for you to show some humility, some self-awareness. But clearly, that's too much to ask. Humility? Ricky repeated. You want to talk about humility? You've just spent the last 10 minutes berating a guest on live television because you disagree with his comedy. You've silenced your own panelists when they tried to defend me. You've made this entire segment about your own opinions instead of actually doing an interview. And you're lecturing me about humility? Lorraine's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time since the interview started, she seemed at a loss. I'm done, Ricky said quietly. He turned and began walking toward the edge of the set. If you walk off this set, you'll never be invited back, Lorraine called after him, her voice desperate now. Ricky stopped and turned around one last time. Lorraine, with all due respect, after this, I wouldn't want to come back. He disappeared through the gap in the curtains that led backstage. The camera stayed on Lorraine, who was standing in the middle of the set, her face a mixture of anger and shock. Sarah and James sat frozen on the sofa, neither of them knowing what to do or say. The audience began to murmur among themselves, the sound growing louder by the second. Someone in the front row whispered, "Oh my God," loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Lorraine slowly sat back down in her chair, smoothing down her dress as if trying to regain some sense of composure. She looked directly into the camera, her face hardening into a mask of forced professionalism. "Well," she said, her voice strained, "I think that shows you exactly the kind of person we're dealing with. Someone who can't handle being challenged." Sarah's head snapped up, and she stared at Lorraine with an expression of disbelief. James shifted in his seat, looking like he wanted to say something, but thought better of it. "I make no apologies for asking difficult questions." Lorraine continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "This show has always been about honest conversations, and if some people can't handle that, then perhaps they shouldn't agree to come on in the first place." The murmuring in the audience grew louder. Several people were shaking their heads. One woman in the third row actually stood up and started making her way toward the exit, clearly disgusted by what she had just witnessed. "Lorraine," James said quietly, leaning forward, "I think maybe we should acknowledge that things got a bit out of hand there." "Out of hand?" Lorraine turned to him sharply. "What got out of hand, James, was a guest who couldn't handle being held accountable for his actions." "But you called him a coward," Sarah interjected, her voice stronger now. "On live television, that's not just asking difficult questions, that's a personal attack." "I stand by what I said," Lorraine insisted, crossing her arms. "He uses his platform to say whatever he wants without consequences, and when someone finally pushes back, he runs away. If that's not cowardly behavior, I don't know what is." James shook his head slowly. "I have to disagree, Lorraine. I've been on this show for 5 years, and I've never seen you treat a guest like that. What we just saw was uncomfortable to watch." "Oh, so now you're both turning on me?" Lorraine's voice rose in pitch again. "I bring you both onto this show, give you a platform, and this is how you repay me?" Sarah's eyes widened. "We're not turning on you. We're just saying that maybe the interview could have been handled differently." "I don't need parenting from my own panelists," Lorraine snapped. "I know how to do my job. I've been doing this for decades." The audience was now openly reacting. Several more people were standing up, and the murmuring had turned into full conversations. Someone near the back shouted, "Let them speak," which was met with a smattering of applause. Lorraine's face went pale and then red. She looked around the studio, seeming to realize for the first time that the room had turned against her. "We need to go to a commercial break," she said. Suddenly, looking off camera toward the production staff. "Cut to commercial. Now." But the camera stayed on her. The director, it seemed, was either frozen in shock or had decided that this was too compelling to cut away from. "I said go to commercial," Lorraine repeated, her voice shrill now. James leaned toward Sarah and whispered something that the microphones barely picked up. "This is a disaster." Sarah nodded, her face pale. Lorraine stood up abruptly from her chair. "Fine. If no one is going to listen to me, then what's the point?" She looked directly into the camera. "We'll be right back." Apparently. She stormed off the set in the opposite direction that Ricky had gone, leaving Sarah and James sitting alone on the sofa, staring at each other in stunned silence. The camera slowly zoomed out to show the full set, empty except for the two panelists who looked like they wished they could disappear. The audience was still buzzing with conversation, some people standing, others gesturing animatedly to their neighbors. Sarah finally broke the silence. "Should we, say something?" James looked around helplessly. "I have absolutely no idea what we're supposed to do right now." A producer finally rushed onto the set, a young woman with a headset and a clipboard, looking absolutely frantic. She leaned down between Sarah and James, whispering urgently. The microphones picked up fragments. "Just sit tight. We're trying to figure out what to do." "This has never happened before." Sarah nodded, looking relieved to have some kind of direction, even if it was just to sit there. James rubbed his temples, looking like he had a splitting headache. The producer straightened up and looked directly into the camera, waving her hand in a cutting motion across her throat. Finally, mercifully, the feed cut to black. Backstage, away from the cameras and the audience, Ricky Gervais was sitting in the green room, shaking his head in disbelief. A production assistant had offered him water, which he accepted gratefully. His tour manager, who had been watching the whole thing from the wings, was pacing back and forth. "That was insane," his tour manager said. "I've never seen anything like that on morning television." Ricky took a sip of water. "Neither have I, and I've been on a lot of talk shows." "What was her problem?" the tour manager asked. "Did something happen before you went on that I don't know about?" "No," Ricky said, setting down the water bottle. "I met her briefly before the show, and she seemed fine." A bit cold maybe, but nothing that would make me think it would go like that. She came at you from the very beginning, the tour manager observed. It was like she had already decided she didn't like you before you even sat down. Ricky nodded slowly. Yeah, it felt personal, like she had an axe to grind. Meanwhile, back on the set, the commercial break was in full swing, but instead of the usual advertisements, the broadcast was showing a holding screen with the show's logo and some generic music. Behind the scenes, there was chaos. Lorraine had locked herself in her dressing room and was refusing to come out. The executive producer was standing outside the door, knocking gently and trying to coax her back to the set. "Lorraine, we need you," the producer was saying. "We've got 20 minutes of show left. We can't just end it here." From inside the dressing room came a muffled shout. "I'm not going back out there. Did you see how they looked at me? My own panelists, the audience, they were all on his side." "Nobody is on anyone's side," the producer said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We just need to get through the rest of the show. We can deal with everything else later." "I won't apologize." Lorraine's voice came through the door. "I said what needed to be said. Someone had to." The producer sighed and leaned his forehead against the door. This was, without question, the worst day of his 1987 career. Back in the studio, Sarah and James were still sitting on the sofa, though now they were at least able to talk freely without being on camera. "I can't believe that just happened," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In all my time on this show, I've never seen Lorraine like that." "She was out of line," James said firmly. "Way out of line. Ricky was right to walk off. I would have done the same thing." "Do you think she'll come back?" Sarah asked. James shrugged. "I honestly don't know, but if she does, it's going to be incredibly awkward." In the audience, people were starting to get restless. They had been sitting through the extended commercial break for almost 10 minutes now, and there was no sign of the show resuming. Some people were checking their phones, others were standing up to stretch their legs. One woman in the front row turned to her friend and said, loud enough for people around her to hear, "I came here expecting a nice morning chat show, and instead I got a full-blown argument. This is better than anything on Netflix." Her friend laughed nervously. "I felt so bad for Ricky. She was really going after him." "I know," the first woman agreed. "And he handled it so well. He tried to stay calm and explain himself, and she just kept attacking him. It was painful to watch." Similar conversations were happening all throughout the audience. The consensus was clear. Lorraine had gone too far, and Ricky had been the reasonable one in the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the executive producer made a decision. The show would continue, but without Lorraine. Sarah and James would host the remainder of the program, and they would do their best to smooth over what had just happened without dwelling on it too much. The producer rushed back onto the set and explained the plan to Sarah and James, who both looked relieved to have something concrete to do, even if it meant suddenly being thrust into the hosting position without any preparation. "Just be yourselves," the producer told them. "Talk about the upcoming segments, introduce the next guest, and try to bring some normalcy back to the show. Can you do that?" Sarah and James both nodded, though they looked terrified. The cameras came back on, and the show resumed. Sarah, to her credit, jumped right in with a bright smile that almost masked her nervousness. "Welcome back, everyone," she said, her voice only slightly shaky. "We're going to continue with the show, and we have a wonderful cooking segment coming up next with Chef Marco, who's going to show us how to make the perfect autumn soup." James chimed in, trying to match her energy. "That's right. And later, we'll be talking to a family who rescued a dog from a shelter and the heartwarming story of how that dog changed their lives." They were doing their best, but the elephant in the room was impossible to ignore. The audience was still buzzing with energy from what they had witnessed, and no amount of cheerful small talk about soup recipes was going to make people forget what had just happened. The cooking segment proceeded as planned, with Chef Marco demonstrating his recipe while Sarah and James asked questions and tried to act like everything was normal. But even Chef Marco seemed aware that something had gone terribly wrong. He kept glancing nervously at the empty host chair, clearly wondering where Lorraine was. When the segment ended and they cut to another commercial break, Sarah slumped back on the sofa and let out a long breath. "I don't think I've ever been that stressed in my entire life," she said. James laughed weakly. "You did great. We both did, given the circumstances." The show limped to its conclusion, with Sarah and James gamely hosting the remaining segments. The family with the rescue dog appeared and told their story, which was genuinely touching and provided a brief respite from the tension that had dominated the broadcast. As the final segment wrapped up and the credits began to roll, Sarah looked into the camera with a smile that was equal parts exhausted and relieved. Thank you all so much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. The moment the cameras cut, both Sarah and James collapsed back into the sofa cushions, the adrenaline finally wearing off. I need a drink, James muttered. A very large drink. Sarah laughed despite herself. Make that two. The audience filed out of the studio, most of them immediately pulling out their phones to text or call friends and family about what they had just witnessed. It would be all over social media within minutes, dissected and analyzed by millions of people who hadn't even been there. In the green room, Ricky was getting ready to leave. His tour manager had already arranged for a car to pick them up at a side entrance to avoid any potential media that might be gathering out front. "Are you okay?" the tour manager asked as they walked toward the exit. Ricky nodded. "Yeah, I'm fine. It was just bizarre. I kept waiting for her to crack a smile and reveal that it was all some kind of elaborate prank, but it never came. She was genuinely angry." "Well, you handled it perfectly," the tour manager said. "You stayed calm, you defended yourself without getting nasty, and you knew when it was time to leave. That's the mark of someone who's been doing this for a long time." Ricky smiled slightly. "Thanks. Though I have to say, I'd rather not have to handle situations like that at all." They reached the exit, and Ricky paused before pushing open the door. He looked back down the corridor toward the studio, thinking about Lorraine, about Sarah and James, about the audience that had watched the whole thing unfold. "You know what the strangest part is?" he said quietly. "I actually felt sorry for her at the end. She was so convinced she was in the right, so sure that she was the hero of the story, that she couldn't see how badly she was coming across. That's almost sad." His tour manager considered this. "Maybe, but she made her choices. You can't save people from themselves." Ricky nodded, and together they stepped out into the afternoon air, leaving the chaos of the studio behind them. Back in her dressing room, Lorraine Kelly finally emerged after the show had ended. The hallway was mostly empty now, just a few crew members packing up equipment and getting ready to go home. She walked slowly back toward the studio, her heels clicking against the floor. The set was dark now, the lights turned off, the cameras covered. It looked somehow sad in its emptiness, like a theater after the audience has gone home. Lorraine stood in the middle of the space, looking at the empty chairs, the abandoned coffee cups on the table, the notes scattered across the floor. She had been so sure, so absolutely certain that she was doing the right thing, that someone needed to challenge Ricky Gervais, to hold him accountable, to not just let him get away with saying whatever he wanted without pushback. But standing here now, in the quiet aftermath, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The executive producer appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "We need to talk," he said simply. Lorraine turned to face him, her chin lifting slightly in defiance. "I know what you're going to say. Do you?" he asked, walking onto the set to stand near her. "Because I'm not sure you do. Lorraine, what happened today, that can't happen again. Ever." "He walked off my show," Lorraine said, her voice defensive. "He's the one who behaved unprofessionally." The producer shook his head slowly. "No, Lorraine, you attacked a guest, repeatedly, on live television. And when your own panelists tried to moderate the situation, you snapped at them too. This wasn't an interview. This was, I don't even know what to call it." Lorraine's face flushed. "I was asking tough questions. That's what journalists do." "There's a difference between tough questions and personal attacks," the producer said firmly. "You called him a coward. You accused him of being attention-seeking. You told him he couldn't handle criticism. Those aren't questions, Lorraine. Those are judgments. And they have no place in an interview on this show." Lorraine opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, she seemed to be questioning herself, doubt creeping into her expression. The producer softened slightly, his voice becoming gentler. "Look, I know you're passionate about things. I know you have strong opinions, but you can't let those opinions turn you into someone who forgets basic, professional courtesy. Ricky Gervais is a guest. He came here voluntarily to promote his tour, to have a conversation, to connect with your audience. And instead, he got ambushed." "I didn't ambush him," Lorraine protested weakly. "Yes," the producer said quietly. You did. And we're going to have to deal with the fallout from that. This is going to be everywhere by tonight. The video, the reactions, the analysis. And I can tell you right now, the narrative is not going to be kind to you. Lorraine sank down into her chair, the fight seeming to drain out of her all at once. She put her face in her hands, and for a moment, she looked very small and very tired. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice muffled. The producer sighed. "You take some time. You think about what happened and why it happened, and then, if you can, you find a way to make it right. But that's going to take time, Lorraine. A lot of time." He turned and walked off the set, leaving her alone in the darkened studio. Lorraine sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, replaying the interview over and over in her mind. Each time she remembered something she had said, something she had done, the weight in her chest grew heavier. She had wanted to be brave, to stand up for what she believed in, to not be another talk show host who just lobbed softball questions at celebrities and let them say whatever they wanted. But somewhere along the way, bravery had turned into aggression, conviction had become cruelty, and she had been so caught up in her own righteousness that she hadn't noticed until it was far too late. The studio lights flickered off one by one as the building prepared to close for the evening. Lorraine Kelly sat alone in the darkness, finally understanding that sometimes the person you need to hold accountable is yourself.